Well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. My name is Mike Goldsworthy, and it is good to have you with us today. We have a treat. I am excited to get to introduce you to Chuck DeGroat. Chuck, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mike.
For those of you who don't know, and my guess is that for folks that are paying attention to this podcast, many of you probably know who Chuck is, particularly through his last book that came out, When Narcissism Comes to Church. Did I get that's the right title, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But if you don't know Chuck, in addition to writing that he's a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary out in Michigan. He's the founding executive director of the clinical mental health counseling program there, a licensed therapist, spiritual director, author, retreat leader, speaker, and faculty member with the Soul Care Institute. Which, like, you were doing a lot just with that. Who runs the Soul Care Institute? What is that out of?
Yeah, so that was started out of like a retreat ministry called the Potter's Inn, guy named Steve Smith, but it's now run by Kayleen Dirksen and her husband Jim. Kayleen is the president, and it's great. It's 2 years, 6 weeks, cohort-based kind of program.
Wonderful. In addition to all that, you specialize in navigating issues of trauma, pastoral care, abuse, pastoral leadership, and leadership health, doubt, dark nights of the faith journey. And you train clergy in handling issues of abuse. You do, pastor, planter. So you do all kinds of things. You are a
Yeah,
busy
I'm
man.
tired just hearing all that.
I was reading through this and I was like, gosh, for somebody like as I read your book that I was like, it feels like you've got really healthy rhythms in life. And then I read
Yeah,
that and I'm like, gosh, how do you get all of that done?
yeah. No, that's that. Yeah, that's a good question. Can we talk about that? You got
Yeah.
any for me?
No, well, I would love to hear. I mean, I want to talk about
Yeah,
your book.
yeah.
So for folks to know before, like we're going to talk about, he's got a new book coming out called Healing What's Within, comes out
Yeah.
October 8th. But yeah, how do you balance? Like, what does that look like for you? It seems like you've got
Yeah.
a bit of drivenness to,
Yeah, well, I've always been kind of entrepreneurial, and when I served a couple of different churches, you and I were just talking before this about the church I served in San Francisco, um, and I started things in those places. And I've always had energy to do those kinds of things. I think seminary affords me a bit of space and time to do some more things because it's you're not as your life isn't as full as pastoral life, and so I've got my classes that I teach, but I do have some space to engage some other writing, retreat leading, and then I've got to be really disciplined in terms of my capacity to say no, especially when it comes to I get a lot of emails from people. I get emails every day from people who have experienced abuse in the church, uh, people who maybe want to get some counseling or want me to do an investigation, and I just say no 90% of the time. So yeah.
yeah. And then, like, was this a late shift for you? Did you think you'd be in like local church pastoral ministry forever? And then you had this shift to say, like, oh, I think I could root myself in this larger institution that would afford me these other abilities.
Yeah, I think in seminary, I thought I would do a PhD in biblical studies, and so there was a shift in seminary to get the degree in clinical mental health counseling, and that led me into the church. But yeah, when I was in the church, I mean, I didn't imagine myself leaving it, but we in the Bay Area had started something called New Begin House of Studies, and we had found a seminary partner, the seminary I'm at now, and and, you know, it's tough living with 2 young kids in the city of San Francisco, and there was an opening in pastoral care, and I sort of discerned I can continue to work with the church in San Francisco. I could sort of have the best of both worlds because I really liked my colleagues out there, and so I did the dance between San Francisco and Michigan for about 5 years before some of those things began to shift, but yeah, I don't think I ever imagined being a full-time seminary prof,
Mm,
and sometimes when people say that, I am? Really? Yeah,
sure, sure. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, New Begin House of Studies, fantastic thing that sprung up out of City Church in San Francisco, but is now the Faith and Justice Network, led by Peter Choi, who we've had on the podcast talking about the great work that they're doing. Um, Well, tell me about healing what's within. Tell me a little bit about, like, what was the impetus
Yeah.
behind the book? What, got you stirring in it?
Yeah. Well, I part of it has to do with the narcissism book, and people who I heard from who wanted to heal. And the question is always, how do I heal? What's that work look like? And I've been doing that work for 25 years now with folks. It began back in the late 90s when I was in a more conservative complementarian context, and I was seeing issues of abuse of women all over the place. And I would, I was trying to learn on the job back then. I remember trying to understand emotional abuse and trying to find book resources. They just weren't out there back in the day. Very few spiritual abuse resources back in the day. So I've been doing it a long time, and I thought, well, maybe this is a time to write a book on how we heal and what that looks like, but also to really integrate it with a new way of reading Genesis chapter 3 and the kindness and compassion of God. I mean, I'd heard that story for so many years as a story of tragedy and sin and failure and I wanted to sort of re-narrate that story in a way that offered people a vision of God's compassion, because what we know about trauma is that it's healed in the presence of an empathetic witness. And I think we need that from one another and from therapists, but I think if we can experience God as an empathetic witness, that's really important too.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful, and maybe it'd be helpful even as we get going to, like, the way that you talk about trauma, I found really helpful, and a part of it was stemmed from I think it was on Twitter, I saw somewhere online where you had responded to some folks who were reacting against what they felt like was the overuse of the word trauma,
Yeah,
that
sure.
it's, like, become colloquial and we just kinda use it for whatever.
Yeah.
And I saw you respond to essentially say, like, it seems like you all haven't been paying attention to the latest what's been being written about what
Yeah.
trauma is.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the trauma conversation has really evolved, and if you're not tuned into that, I understand. And by the way, the word is misused and overused. I mean, but narcissism is too, and there are lots of words that are sin is misused and over. I mean, so we don't just get rid of words because they're misused and overused. We try to bring clarity, and that's what I tried to do with the narcissism book, and that's what I try to do here. But the idea, the real short some of it is that, the language of trauma really um, took root in wartime studies back in the 1950s, right? And when we were talking about acute instances of trauma, like an experience of someone who'd been in war, now coming back, hyper vigilant, nightmares, and all the symptoms, right? And out of that came a diagnosis of PTSD. But But as people understood the symptoms of trauma, the avoidance, the numbing, the dissociation, the hypervigilance, um, therapists, as we were apt to do, said there are a lot of people who struggle with that. And in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, people started talking more about chronic trauma, the kind of chronic trauma that comes out of things like domestic violence, right? um, or medical procedures, things as simple as that. And then that conversation expanded in the 90s and the 2000s into complex trauma, which is to say, more relational trauma, the kind of trauma we experience when not just when we're abused, but when our needs are not met. And so complex trauma takes attachment seriously and our deep relational attachment needs. And so there was this gradual expansion of the language of trauma to include those who grew up in homes that seemed fairly normal, but didn't experience the love that they needed to experience and experience the same. Here's the deal, they experience the same kind of symptoms. So, whether you were in war or experienced a terrible natural disaster, domestic violence, or your needs weren't met, what we were seeing is people were experiencing the same symptoms. So, we often say trauma is not what happened to you, but what happens within you, the imprint within, and how that shows up.
Yeah, that was so helpful for me because it's really easy to compare, like, say, for instance, my own experiences to experiences of others that, like, I just know through my own pastoral counseling with them or just through their own stories that, like, gosh, what they have been through is so much more severe than what I've been through, and to call my experience trauma at the same level as theirs,
Yeah.
like, it has sometimes felt like there's something wrong, and that,
Yeah.
that you used a Gabor Mate quote that trauma is not what happens to us, but when we hold inside the absence of an empathetic witness.
Right.
Like, that was a really helpful phrase
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's important because even with the narcissism and abuse work in the church, like I've sat with groups of people where people are comparing, like well, you were here for 20 years and I was only here for 2 years. And the reality is, as I say, two people can go through the exact same event. Let's say a tornado comes through town and destroys two homes. Two people can go through that exact same event, and one person could come away with some stress, but not trauma, and the other one could be severely traumatized because of it. And a lot of that has to do with that the person's family of origin story and how they experience care, attunement, and attachment in the midst of pain. A lot of that has to do with the kind of attunement they receive in the midst of the traumatic experience, like who comes around them after the tornado passes through. And so it's not helpful to compare. It's never about the extent of the event. It's always about your inner experience. And so that's for me in my work. I'm a therapist, right? A lot of the time I have to sit and really attune to people and understand their own experiences. Never ever compare um, people who have similar things happen to them.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Um, yeah, I appreciate it the way you open up the book, like, you just starkly open up by saying it's something like, "20 years ago, I was fired," is something like is the first
Yeah,
line, I think, in the
yeah,
book.
yeah.
And you tell a story about that, about being fired from a church.
Mhm.
And then some of what you talk about within that is the experience of the silence of people within the church who you had
Yeah,
considered friends,
yeah,
and then the fear that overtook you. And
yeah,
immediately as I was reading that, I felt like, gosh, anybody who's been in a pastoral position, whether they've been fired or not, relates immediately with all of these experiences of something happening in the church where you feel abandoned by people who you thought were close, where you, like, are walking down grocery store aisles trying to avoid seeing
yes,
people, like, where you've got all of that. And
yeah,
then you wrote this, you said, "In our effort to pursue justice for what happened to us, we begin to hinder any chance at healing what's within."
yeah.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the way that we sort of avoid that experience.
Yeah. So, that's not to say that we don't pursue justice, right? In fact, Judith Herman is still writing. She just came out with another book, Truth and Repair. It's astounding to me that she's still writing, but it's an incredible book on pursuing justice. I do think, though, that for those of us who are in the midst of our trauma, very externalized and wanting to pursue justice and feeling like if we can just get the pastor to admit that he was wrong and the church to make reparation of some kind, then the trauma will go away. That doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. It might give you a bit of a sense of closure, but I can tell you over the course of really 25 years of doing this, I've sat with people who got their closure, got their justice. They got the 6 month severance or whatever. And it's like, how come 3 years ago this happened and I still feel so disconnected from my body? I still numb out and self medicate. I'm still so angry at my kids. Like, what is that? Like, all of that is is sort of in the past. I've gotten some. So this is where we have to take seriously the lingering inner impact of trauma, and it's not at all to dismiss what happened to us, but a lot of that we can't control. What we can attend to is what's happening within us.
Hmm. And would one of the, like, you talk about, like, body dashboard indicators, but would
Yeah.
one of the, like, indicators of, like, that we gotta there's something we gotta pay attention to is that we're still, like, I wouldn't say like a longing for justice, but still like a harping voice that's there that's like, "This thing needs to be made right, and it hasn't yet,"
Yeah.
and that there's like a nagging maybe?
Yeah, it could be. And that I'll use that answer a lot when I do these kinds of conversations because that longing for justice is a good longing. But there might be a part of someone that needs control, like needs to take this person down, and that's the part. Generally,
Yeah.
generally that's operating out of our sympathetic nervous system and a fight part within us, the part that just wants to take the person who wronged us on, and we have to shift from that autonomic state of what I call sympathetic storm, where we're constantly churning with this fight energy, and shift to a state where our longing can still be there, but it's kind of in the Christian tradition, we call it a dispossessive longing. It's an open-handed longing. It's a surrendered longing. Like I long for justice, but I probably can't have justice on my own terms. And it's probably not good for me, because what we end up doing is a lot of us who've been through this, we end up harming ourselves through our own efforts to get justice, through our own control, through our own fight. And sometimes even through our own gaslighting when we don't do it in the way that we should have done it. And, so we can be our own worst enemy at that point.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really helpful. I'll um I'll stop trying to ask general questions to use you for my own
No.
free therapy right now. Um so you frame the book around, you mentioned a reframing of Genesis 3, and you use
Yeah.
these three questions from Genesis 3 to kind of frame it. Yeah, do you mind sharing with folks kind of that framework, those three questions?
Yeah. So this goes way, way back for me, where I began hearing, "Where are you?" In Genesis chapter 3. The first question that God asks when I was walking the garden in the cool of the day. I began hearing that as a very kind question when I was off on silent retreat, probably 20 years ago now. And I thought, well, that's not right. God has to be angry. That's the God I grew up with. There's got to be some sort of punishment here. There's got to be God's got to be marching through the garden in the cool of the day. Where the hell are you? That kind of thing. And really, in many ways, contemplative spirituality was an important part of my own shift, personally, spiritually, theologically. That those spaces where in the silence I could experience something new. It's not always about knowing something new, right? Learning something new. It's about a new experience of God's smile, God's kindness. This is what the mystics teach us. And so I just began listening more. Where are you? Who told you is the beginning of the second question that God asks, which is to say, who whispered these lies to you? Who told you this counterfeit story? Um, uh, I whispered over you goodness, worth, belonging, purpose. Who told you something different than that? Who told you I couldn't be trusted? So where are you? Who told you? And then the third question was the toughest one. And back when I was serving in San Francisco, I led a number of silent retreats, and we were wrestling with these three questions. And I had kept hearing myself say, "Have you eaten from the tree?" The third question that God asks. And in the midst of that silent retreat, another question popped up that I think gets to the spirit of the question, and that's, "Where have you taken your hunger and thirst?"
Hmm.
And to me, that's a question that has deep roots in the Christian spiritual tradition, and that sense of that we take our desires to things that won't satisfy in the deepest ways. And so, yeah, those are the three questions. And as I say in the book, I think they're really kind questions. I think they're really curious questions that doesn't negate the reality that, as the story goes, there are 1,185 chapters between Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22, where there's plenty of violence and misogyny and genocide and envy and rape and murder and all the things. Doesn't negate any of that. There's bad stuff going on in the world, right? But it does say something about God's character and who God is.
Yeah, I love that. And so the first question, where are you, is really about locating yourself, paying attention to yourself and your body and
Yeah.
what's going
Yeah,
on.
yeah, that's where I go with it. I mean, I'm engaging the text in an imaginative way,
Sure.
right? So I've definitely been at retreats where I've offered these, and I've had the one person at the end of the treat wait to speak to me to say, "Well, this isn't good exegesis," but the way I see it is Adam and Eve are hiding, and they're sowing fig leaves, which is to say they're afraid. Their autonomic nervous systems are implicated in this, adrenaline, cortisol shooting through their bodies, right? They're afraid. They hear God walking in the cool of the day and they think they're in trouble.
Yeah.
And it's an invitation for them to pay attention to what's going on within them. Where are you right now? Well, like in my life, how am I hiding? How am I sowing fig leaves? How have I pulled away? How am I disconnected? Because I think you've done a little bit of the reading. I talk a lot about the autonomic nervous system.
Yep.
And we live in these survival states, which are self-protective. So we're designed for connection. We thrive in connection, but we live in these self-protective states. And that's the state that they were in. And so it's like, where are you in your particular self-protective state today? And how can you shift toward connection?
Okay. So the where are you? Yeah, locating yourself in that kind of way. And then
Uh,
who told you is about
yeah.
like what voices are you paying attention to that's giving you worth and value?
Yeah, I think it's like, what's the story behind the "Where are you?"
Hmm.
You know, how did you get here? Who have you been listening to? And oftentimes when I lead retreats on this, I'll invite people to scan their pasts. And I often talk about what it means to be an image bearer as worth, belonging, and purpose. And there's a reason for those three that gets into some work I did in biblical studies years ago. But uh, where where what are stories that you might remember where, your sense of worth was, ripped from you, challenged, where your sense of belonging was lost, where you felt alienated, alone, where your sense of purpose was obliterated, Like, everyone it seems to me as I do these kinds of retreats, everyone has a story of some kind, and they'll say, "Yeah, like, I've never known worth, belonging, or purpose. Like all I knew in my family of origin was you'll never be good enough, you don't matter and you'll never be loved, And so there are those painful stories, but I think we can also scan our stories for places where we did hear those things and wonder like who whispered that
Hmm.
over you or into your life.
Yeah. And you also, I found it really fascinating, talked about like some folks are carrying around like generational stories, like
Mhm.
just
Yeah.
bodily, that it's not necessarily conscious. It's like subconsciously or bodily carrying around these
Yeah.
generationals.
I mean, this is a lot of the new work that's happening in my field, but uh, we're talking now about generational trauma and how the stories of our grandparents and great grandparents live on in our bodies, and that people might say, "Well, how? What does that mean? Are we? Does that just mean we're genetically predisposed?" And it is to say, and I won't get into the science of it, that we carry the possibility, based on how our lives unfold and the kind of trauma we experience in our own lives, for our bodies to remember the the somatic echoes. I'm not saying this well, but like the somatic reverberations of the experience of domestic violence that our grandmother had. And now that it's the stories that come up when you engage this are fascinating. How our bodies remember. You know, I heard a story that my grandpa had headaches like that, and I have the same kinds of headaches. Or he had knee pain, and I had knee pain too. It's really fascinating, and it's a new realm of study. But what it does is it expands that sense of mystery. Like I used to approach my own story like looking for um, like looking for the smoking gun from my past to explain all of my idiosyncrasy today, right? And now I know that when I look at my story, there are the things that happened to me, but there are things that are like reverberations from generations ago. And this is really important, by the way, for conversations of racial trauma. Um, Clearly, this conversation is being led and should be led by people of color who are speaking to these resonances and these echoes of generations of body blows. So it's really important.
Wow. Okay. So there's the where are you, who told you, and then have you eaten from the tree about like where are you putting your hunger? What are you longing for is one of the ways that
Yeah,
I saw you phrase it.
yeah. This is a question that gets at addiction, and the ways that we self medicate our pain. Because when we ignore trauma, we invariably self medicate. So let's just say we're not answering that question, where are you? So we're living hidden, fig-leaved lives and we're not engaging our stories. And so we're living disconnected. We we're born to be seen and known, to experience soothing, care, delight. So we're going to go looking for that somewhere else, inevitably we're going to find it, whether it's in a bottle or in a fair or in any number of different things. I mean, we use all kinds of things to regulate. Um, People use sports to regulate. I know people who are so eager for the football season to begin because it's like, I know where I'm gonna be on something about I'll ask people about their nervous systems, and they'll be like, "Yeah, it's just like something happens." And, on Sunday afternoon, I just find my way into this zone, well, it's not through connection with their spouse, or God, or it's some sort of, regulation that happens through food or drink or, a substance or sex or whatever. I mean, we can turn all sorts of good things into illicit things, right? And so that's what that section gets at.
Yeah. Did you notice in your work, post COVID, that this kind of stuff the dial getting turned up here for folks, or
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think part of it, I mean, everyone's looking for the root, like what
yeah,
how to get here, right? I mean, I think at least part of it, and I'm not saying this is the root, but we were so isolated and lonely, and people found ways to cope. And so you know, there are there are ways that people are continuing to talk about, and at least in the work that I'm doing, that emerged out of that time of loneliness and isolation and disconnection, that are continued ways of coping even today. And so, yeah, I mean, that had a big impact in the evolution of our ways of coping for sure.
okay. I'm also kind of curious if we think about those three questions, and your work is primarily in the Christian space, have you noticed that there's one of those questions that tends to be harder for folks that define themselves as Christian to engage, that tend to be ones that they're more avoidant of?
I mean, I think, I hate to say this, I do find Christians to be more avoidant in general,
Yeah.
because we by and large learn to spiritually bypass and maybe sprinkle a little bit of Jesus, or just call upon the gospel as if the gospel is this mysterious thing that cures our ills, right? Rather than doing the work of really engaging their pain. And so I find all manner of spiritual bypassing, being, being at play in the lives of the Christians that I see. And spiritual bypassing can look like a lot of different things, but I think by and large, when I work with people, who would not, say that they follow Jesus, or may they come from some different kind of, spiritual tradition or something like that. They tend to be more open, particularly to, uh, more somatically oriented work in counseling. I think Christians by and large want more intellectualistic kinds
Mhm.
of, solutions. Is there a way that I could rethink this? Is there a way that you can frame this? Um, can I understand it through the lens of something that I've done or a sin that I've committed? Or so you've got to get through a lot of resistance sometimes with Christians, particularly if they haven't done any spiritual direction work or therapeutic work on these things.
Wow. Yeah, I was telling you before we started recording, a lot of my work is with post-evangelical pastors,
Mhm.
and, uh, I'll do, like, a little tangent to get to where I
Yeah, please.
wanna go to with it. That, one of the things that I had begun diagnosing early on in my work with post-evangelical pastors was around, like, stages of faith theory,
Mhm.
and that you hit the point that, in Critical Journey, the authors call the wall,
Yep.
and that there was a lot of folks who, at the point of the wall, don't do the internal work, and they
Yep.
regress backwards to an earlier stage of faith,
Yeah.
but they're just, they're now progressive and they were conservative, but they're still a stage 2 or 3
Yeah.
faith, right?
Yeah. Hear that.
Um, so that had been a lot of my work with post-evangelical pastors have been, like, kind of framing that. One of the things that I feel like has been opening up for me more lately that your book was really helpful with was also this recognition that I think a lot of post-evangelical pastors are coming into leading a church with a lot of trauma,
Yeah.
and particularly religious trauma. And
Yeah.
then they're pastoring communities that are full of people who they're trying to create this safe space. So all these people who are now also bringing all of their trauma into that place because they feel safe there.
Yeah.
And I've begun to get a little bit like, I don't want to, concerned is the wrong word. I think aware of wanting to help pastors who are carrying their own traumas into spaces where they're trying to create space for other trauma.
Wow. Yeah.
And um
Yes.
and if trauma is about feeling alone with events that have happened to you, it's not necessarily about the events, but aloneness. and you
Mhm,
already have a high rate of pastoral loneliness.
mhm.
So this long kind of little rabbit trail to say, like, could you
Yeah,
speak a little bit to pastors specifically who are leading and maybe have some awareness of some wounds, and maybe or even just leading through it because they want to create this
yeah,
safe community for others?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that, what you're getting at is so much of this work is somatic, is embodied, and what I mean by that is that there I think when people hit the wall, so you and I are both familiar with Janet Hagberg's work, and you've been using it, in this whatever we might call it, this moment of disorientation, crisis, midlife, the wall, the fourth dwelling, as Saint Teresa of Avila calls it, the dark night of the soul, all these moments. There are some who, are doing a lot of deconstructing around that time, around things that they thought or believed at one point, maybe don't now, or they're being challenged. But unless you do the somatic work, which is to say, unless you tune into what's going on in your nervous system, um, you're not going to move, because I think what ends up happening is when you hit this wall, when you're in this season of disorientation, um, you have an opportunity to shift from a place of control, which is a very sympathetically oriented state, oftentimes kind of more of a fight or flight kind of space, to a place of surrender, an open-handed place, which we now know, in nervous system terms, is the ventral vagal space of the spiritual and physiological center of our being, where we experience connection and curiosity and compassion and belonging, um, and what I see in my work is that people trade one form of sympathetic activation for another form of sympathetic activation, one form of fight for another form of fight. And so, I went from conservative fight to progressive fight.
Mhm.
I didn't get regulated in the process. I'm still dysregulated. And that's really sad to me, because at that point, there's no um, deep transformational change taking place. There's maybe a little bit of intellectual change that has happened, but no deep transformational work at that point.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And if it's okay, in a moment, when we get ready to wrap up,
Yeah.
bec- you end every chapter with a practice, which I found so helpful, and was able to spend some time walking through a few of them. And I think that might be a helpful way in a few minutes to just kind of plant in your brain, might be a helpful way for us to kind of end for folks.
Oh,
Um, to like have something that moves it from an intellectual exercise to a somatic
yeah.
exercise.
Yes.
Um, you're the section on longing um,
Mm,
grabbed me in a lot of different ways. And I had a lot of things I want to ask you there, but I think maybe I'll just ask this that I was at a gathering a couple weeks ago with a small group of people and was sitting and processing stuff that came out of it with a couple of folks. And a friend and I were talking, and we both identify as threes on the Enneagram. And so, in a lot of ways, we're both pretty driven. We both have, in different ways, experienced some kind of success. And we both identified with a part of our own ego work was having to dismantle some of that.
mhm,
And then both of us said that we feel like we're in a place where we don't have the same sort of drive that we once had, that we don't have that same sort of that
yeah,
there's no sort of thing
yeah,
that we're trying to conquer like we once were.
yeah,
And what we began wondering, and the question of what are you longing for started re-bringing this up for me. What we began wondering is that the right place to land for folks like us, or is the right place to land that in some sort of way there's something that's on the other side that's a reintegrated sort
yeah,
of way of achievement that
yeah,
looks different, but
mhm,
a part of the process of getting there is this letting go of that, and that
yes.
yeah.
It's such a good question. I mean, you're onto something that I think is so big for pastors, and I think, we've in the classic Christian tradition, we've used language of control and surrender, control and letting go. But now we know that what we're talking about are dynamics located within us in our autonomic nervous system. And so many of us, I mean, I think part of the reason why I was able to be so entrepreneurial is I was living largely in a sympathetically oriented state, sympathetic storm, my sympathetic nervous system in constant fight or flight, where there is a lot of energy and that can feel kind of performative and you can get things done. And I think what you might be noticing is what ends up happening is there's this longing for a shift. There's this longing for home, I would say, to be anchored in a place of capital L love, to for our sense of worth and belonging and purpose, um, to be ours and not something that we need to chase after. And that's what we experience when we're in this ventral space. And I think what I do in my work oftentimes is a lot of pastors I work with will say, well, then I'm never going to get anything done. If I shift from this space to this space, I'm just going to be Zen all the time. And what I say is that sympathy, this isn't about this. This isn't bad. Like our nervous system isn't interested in morality. It's not sympathetic bad, ventral good. It's sympathetic survival. I had to go into that state for reasons, your story, my story that we could explore. And that state has worked for me for a long time, but I'm designed to live from this place of connection, using the resources of my sympathetic nervous system in moments when I need a bit more of that energy. I need the gas pedal. I need to be able to get some things done. But if I'm fundamentally living from the spiritual and physiological space of ventral vagal, um, I'm more apt to be resilient. My energy is more sustainable. I certainly can connect because when we're living in sympathetic storm, it's impossible to connect because we're in fight mode or flight mode or et cetera. Right. And so that's the real challenge for pastors oftentimes is to get off that hamster wheel of sympathetic activation, um, shift their entire, somatic experience, autonomic experience into this state of rest and belonging, connection and delight, and then use the resources of sympathetic activation. What I often say, that's the work of the rest of my life because I lived in such chronic sympathetic activation that I landed, well, in a hospital in Mexico in 2012.
Hmm.
And so my body kept the score and my system was septic because of it. And so I have to work to shift to ventral, to let go of control, ego. We've got all different ways of naming it, and and then find my way to some of that good energy and good activation. That sympathy. I don't know if that was too strange a description of
That's great.
that process or what, but I see those two things going hand in hand.
Yeah, that's actually super helpful. I appreciate that. Well, Chuck, I think that this book is such a gift. Healing what's within. And I hope folks will pick it up. I think it's gonna be a resource that's gonna be great for a lot of folks, for pastors and leaders, and for other folks that just to have some really helpful tools at
Yeah.
being able to name what's going on, being able to like start some processes, being able to even like I would imagine that there's folks that would use this alongside counselors and spiritual directors and
Yeah.
that sort of work.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, where can folks find you to pay attention to the work that you're doing?
Well, so before that, your questions are so good, man.
Oh, that's kind.
Well, your I think your intuition around some of these, you know, around developmental psychology and spirituality, these stages of faith, seasons of faith, and the parallels are so interesting that I'd love to sit with you and tease them out for another 2 hours. But thanks for intuiting all that stuff because I think it's just a next level of the conversation that's so important. But yeah, so basically on social media spaces at Chuck DeGroat. So, X, threads, Instagram, not TikTok. I'm just too old for TikTok at this point, but those kinds of spaces. And then I've got a website, www.chuckdegroat.net.
Awesome. We'll point folks to all those places.
Wow.
I would love to, yeah, online or offline to push into that conversation some more. I think that'd be super interesting.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Do you, is there a practice that comes to mind that you
Yeah.
would love to leave folks with?
Well, so one of my favorite practices uses the St. Patrick breastplate prayer, Christ above me, Christ below me, some a version of that. um, with something called open focus breathing, um, an open focus way of like engaging the world. Have you heard of open focus, by the way? Les
No.
Femi's work, Les Femi, Fehmi. Open focus gets at um, how we attend to things, and so we attend with narrow attention, oftentimes very sympathetically activated, like scroll, 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 because I've got to find something immediately, right? Versus more of an open focus, which is more expansive, which is what I want for myself and I want for people in general to live more expansive, spacious lives. And so the practice would be breathing in Christ above me, breathing out Christ below me, breathing in Christ to the left of me, breathing out Christ to the right of me, breathing in Christ behind me, breathing out Christ before me, breathing in Christ within me, breathing out Christ around me. And I just did that really fast. Obviously, that was a very abbreviated
Great.
invitation to an exercise that as you do it, I'd want people to find themselves with their in breath and out breath stretching into the above and the below and the left and the right, and almost feeling your body like elastically stretching the left, the right, behind you, before you. Imagining, if you're in a space where there are four walls, stretching to the back wall, stretching to the front wall, stretching to the side wall, maybe stretching, across your county, across your state. I feel my body sometimes stretching all the way across the United States, across the ocean, and it's an attention expanding, um, body expanding kind of exercise that allows you, like, as you do this repeatedly, that allows you not only to experience some sense of connection with God, a God who is above you and below you and within you and around you, um, but from a perspective that when you're done with the practice, shifts your attentional state from a state of sympathetic activation and narrow attention to more expansive attention. Oh, I'm feeling things a little bit more after this. I can see people around me a little bit more. I noticed that cardinal up on the hickory tree in my backyard. That's what that begins to do for you. So it's open focus work, Les Femi's work through the lens of St. Patrick's breastplate prayer.
Phenomenal. Thank you for doing that. Chuck,
Yeah.
Thanks for the work that you do. Thanks for making some time today. Really a gift to get to be with you.
Yeah, you too, Mike. Thanks.